This edition of Break It Down Brown is brought to you by KCWG The Truth, feeding your spirit with a total gospel music mix 24/7. For the best internet radio on the planet, lock it in at kcwgthetruth.com.
Welcome to the Break It Down Brown Show. I'm your host, Marr Brown. This is a show where we take everyday life issues, challenges, and questions, and we break them down. The point of the show is not to change your opinion about a particular subject, rather to change your perspective about it. Today we are going to break down the happiest place on earth. Yes, Disneyland, but not in a way that you might think. Our special guest teaches a course on the history of Disneyland as a vehicle to inspire students, and anyone for that matter, to dream their dream, go after their goals, and live a great story. Let's break it down. Welcome back to the Break It Down Brown Show. It is my pleasure to introduce our very special guest. He is an author, a professor at Cal Baptist University, and a professional speaker, Professor Jeff Barnes. How are you doing, Professor Barnes?
I'm well.
Good to see you,
Jamar.
Thanks for being on the show today. And we're going to break down something very, very interesting. And that is, I know you teach a class at Cal Baptist University called The History of Disneyland, which I've never heard of anybody teaching that in a college setting. So that's awesome. Before we get there, though, I want to talk to you about, just to set this up, history in general, as a history professor, and I need to let the audience know how we met. And we were at an event, a Rotary Club meeting, and you were the keynote speaker, and you gave a talk on the Salem witch trials. It was around Halloween. And I was fascinated by your talk. But what really got me is that when we sat down at the table, and you and I were talking about history and about various things, and you told me that you teach a class at Cal Baptist called The History of Disneyland. And I said, wow, what is that? And the things you told me said, really made me want to have you on the show. So we're going to talk about that in the second half of the show.
Great.
But the first half of the show, let's talk about history and your background. What made you want to become a history professor? And what is it about history that really intrigues you?
Well, really from a very early age. I mean, part of success, Jamar, is following your passion. And for whatever reason, I am wired to be interested in context and background, history. And for me, it's really about story. I know for a lot of folks, history can be a turnoff. It's stories about a bunch of dead guys, or memorization of dates that don't really mean anything. But the truth of the matter is, when you get into history and don't get wrapped around the axle, if you will, about date memorization, what you learn is history has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has some sort of end or some sort of conclusion. And like any good novel that we would get wrapped up in, we can get wrapped up in history as well when we think about it just like that, as being some sort of story. But then, sort of take it a little bit deeper. We often hear that experience is the best teacher. Well, in my experience, experience is the second best teacher. Truth of the matter is, it's the experience of others that is really the very best teacher. And we learn and we hear about the experiences of others through the stories of history.
And that's where, when we sat at the table, I chimed in, and I like to break it down. And I asked you a question because one of the talks that I give to young people is called Your Future Starts Now. But during that talk, I asked the question, does your past exist? And I had never asked that question of a professional. And so I asked you that question, and you gave me your perspective on it. And so I want to go back to that discussion and really let our audience know, because I think it ties into what you said about learning from past and from people in the past. But then I said, does the past exist? Now, do you recall what your response was to that question?
I think I do. I may not be 100% accurate in reflecting back on what that conversation was, but that's okay, because that's really sort of the way history works. And
exactly.
What I mean by that is, we sort of have this ideal that we're going to maybe in an unbiased and perfect sort of way, or perfect world, be able to replicate exactly what happened in the past. And the truth of the matter is, that's impossible. And so what happens is, when we talk about history, you have these events, but those events are unrecoverable. There's no way that we can go back and experience them exactly the way that they occurred. And so what happens is we end up reading the stories that get written about those events.
Right.
And those stories have a particular perspective. Those stories have a particular bias. And that ends up becoming history, or the stories that we tell about the past. And so inevitably, when you say, does history exist? Well, those events occurred, but it's all based on bias, and it's all based on perspective. And so if you stop to think about it, I mean, even in the moment, Jamar, let's forget about whether it's something, that we, either, did experience or were a part of. If you and I were to go through a very similar or the exact same experience today, and then we were to go to retell it to somebody else, you would have your story,
Right.
and I would have my story. You would have your perspective, I would have my perspective. You would have your bias, I would have my bias. And that's really what history is. It's all based on perspective. And so when you talk about the past existing, I think what we really need to be careful and cognizant of is, what are the stories about our past that we're telling and repeating? And is there a way to edit them in such a way so that our stories are a little bit better and a little bit more positive, and hopefully a little bit more motivating?
Yeah, and I think that speaks to one of the aspects of history that I know you focus on. That is the personal development side of it.
Absolutely.
Oftentimes we look at history, we look at the events, and I recall I took a class in college called Arabs and Muslims. Very interesting course in terms of memorizing dates and events. But I didn't really learn a lot about, okay, why did the wars happen? Why was there such a big conflict, and why does it continue to this day, and things of that nature that I know you reflect on, and you go, let's look at the event, look at the perspective of the different sides, and what can you learn from that? So, but that's a very different perspective than I've experienced throughout my schooling in terms of learning about history. So where did that, I guess, difference come from, and from you, from your perspective as a professor of history?
Well, I think first of all, for whatever reason, I sort of paid attention to what was going on in classes and when I was going through school, and specifically what instructors were doing. And I think every student out there has had good teachers, and unfortunately we've all had bad teachers. When I was in college, I had great professors, and I had professors that for whatever reason I didn't particularly care for. I would imagine that you had the very same experience.
True.
Well, what I ended up doing was, when I had the experience of a great professor, I broke it down, if you will. Meaning, I said, okay, well, what is it about this particular instructor that is inspiring me to learn? What is it that they're doing that's motivating me to take this subject a little bit deeper than what the minimum requirements on the syllabus are? And then at the same time, when I had an instructor where I didn't enjoy the class and I didn't feel like I was learning anything, well, I paid attention to that as well. I didn't just blow it off and say, why do I have to suffer through this class, or why couldn't they have a better teacher? And I broke that down as well, and I thought, okay, well, what is this instructor doing that is creating an obstacle to learning? What is this instructor doing that's demotivating rather than motivating? And then when I had the opportunity to be a teacher or to be a professor, I made sure that I followed in the experiences and the patterns of those who I consider to be great, while also making sure I didn't repeat the mistakes or repeat the history of the instructors that I didn't consider to be very good, or the classes that I didn't really learn a whole lot.
Well, Professor, I think what you're saying is important, because that can work for students, but also for professionals, in terms of looking at a situation that we might encounter, which is our perspective is that it's either bad or good, and you're saying you can learn from both sides of it. So tell us about some of the key things that you do teach your students that really helps them to not just go to the class and get through the work, but to really understand what you're teaching and how it applies to their life. Because I think that your thoughts on that can apply to students, but also to professionals as well, because we're dealing with things like that every single day.
Sure. Well, I think first of all, I set the students at ease on the very first day, and I asked them, how many of you have had a negative history class experience? And unfortunately, almost every hand goes up. And then I asked them, okay, well, what was it about that experience that you didn't care for? And it's almost universal. We end up getting tested on a bunch of dates, and it doesn't mean anything to me. And even if I do well, and I typically don't, I don't remember it the next day. I just,
get through
regurgitate it back on the final exam, and I'm done with it. And then I reassure them, well, guess what? I'm not ever going to test you on a single date in this class.
Wow.
So
I wish I had you as my professor. I might have done better. But
and so that puts them at ease. And then I share with them, but what we are going to do is we're going to tell stories.
Okay.
And when you tell a story, every story has a beginning, has a middle, has an end. And so it's not important that you know the date of when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, but it is important that you know that he was elected president, and then the states in the southern part of the United States began to succeed and form the Confederacy, and then we fight the Civil War, and then fortunately the North of the Union prevails, and right during the weekend when the nation is celebrating the end of that very long and very bloody conflict, on Good Friday, Easter weekend, Lincoln tragically is assassinated. I don't care that you know the exact date in April in 1865 that occurred, but I want you to know the order or the chronology in which those events occur.
Interesting.
And then I take it a step further and I remind them that each and every day they're writing their own history. They need to be engaged in their own story. And so I challenge them every Friday before they head off on their weekend to go and have a great weekend. I ask them what are they doing that's sort of fun or exciting or that they're looking forward to. And then I check back in with them on Monday. Okay, well, what was your trip like? What was your hike like? What was the concert like? And the point of that is to get them to appreciate the fact that as they're writing their own history, to get them in the habit of telling their own story.
Interesting.
Because the truth of the matter is, Jamar, if we don't like the story that we're living, everyone has a different choice, meaning the opportunity to edit their life and edit their story so that it ends better than what the current present day is saying.
You're absolutely right. And part of that, the story concept is, that's why I asked earlier, does the past exist? Because, and I tell this funny story about, I had this girlfriend years ago, and she broke up with me because I got an internship at a company, and I had to move to a different city. And I thought it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. I was upset, I was depressed, I was just a mess, and yes, you see the tears. But anyways, a couple months into it, the internship was phenomenal. And long story short, I ended up spending 13 years at that company, going from an intern to a director of sales. And I look back and I said, you know what, that was the absolute best thing that ever happened to me.
Every obstacle is an opportunity.
And I tell that story because it sounds like what you're saying is you can rewrite your history based on your own perspective about what happened. If you could change your mind, you can change your perspective, which means you can change history. You can't change the event, but you can change the what you take away from the event at any given point in your life. Is that a fair statement?
It is. The point is, every event and every experience has a takeaway. And we can either have the takeaway be something that is depressing and debilitating, at which point it then becomes an excuse, and we start blaming the event, we start blaming external factors, we start blaming other people, whatever the case may be, for why we aren't living the great story that we think we should be living or that we're entitled to be living. Or we can have a completely different perspective and see that event with a positive mindset and see those obstacles as in fact opportunities, edit the story a little bit, if you will, and in doing so use it as a motivational and inspirational force to get us to where we want to be.
And I believe in that. I subscribe to that. But I want to be the cynic, right? Because this is break it down, Brown. And there's some people out there that say, you know what, this happened to me in my past, and whether it was at work or my family or a relationship, whatever the case may be, and they say, you know what, Professor Barnes, it sounds great, but you don't know what happened to me. You don't know how painful that moment was. You don't know how that boss really upset me. And so speak to those individuals that may not immediately gravitate towards your perspective and help them to see a different perspective. Because on the Break It Down Brown show, and I say this all the time, we're not trying to change people's opinions. We're just trying to change people's perspective. So I would ask our viewers just to open your perspective for a second, and let's hear how you would address that.
Sure. Think of success in life as like a formula.
Okay.
And you have events, and then you have our response to those events, and all of that equals, at the end of the day, what the outcome or the result might be.
Okay.
And so you and I might experience the exact same event, but the way that we respond to it could be completely different, which means we're each going to have a different outcome.
Okay.
And so what folks need to realize is it's not the event that causes the outcome. It's our response to the event.
Okay.
So for example, I was just reading a story a couple of days ago. A lot of our viewers might remember the Northridge earthquake in 1994. Obviously a calamity. It affected millions of people here in Southern California. And specifically, there was a freeway collapse in the San Fernando Valley. And so as a result, our traffic here in Southern California, which is never great to begin with, became even worse. And so what for some people was a 1-hour commute, instantly, almost overnight, became a 3-hour commute.
Right.
And so you've got media folks out there, and they're interviewing people. How are you dealing with the earthquake? How are you dealing with the freeway collapse? How are you dealing with the longer commute? And sure enough, you've got this stream of cars with drivers and their windows down, and they're just very slowly rolling along, and they're like, man, this is awful. I need to get out of California. First there were fires, and now there's this earthquake, and I just don't know how I'm going to be able to survive and overcome this. This is just ridiculous.
Right.
And then they come across another car and another driver, and this guy could not possibly be happier. And his response was, I left earlier, I loaded up with a bunch of audio tapes, and so I've got my music and I've got my tapes. This is giving me an opportunity to spend some time with myself, listen to some music that I wouldn't have time to listen to otherwise, and catch up on some reading that I didn't have time to do, and learn some things and have some personal growth time. I love living in California, and couldn't care less about the fires, couldn't care less about the earthquakes. This is where I want to be. Now, the event was the same, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Everybody went through the same earthquake. But how we respond creates a different outcome. Either angry and mad and frustrated, or happy, and I'm going to turn this obstacle into an opportunity.
And speaking of happy, we're going to take a break in a second, because we're going to talk about the happiest place on earth.
Great. My favorite
subject. In a second. But I do want to just close with this statement. There's this equation that I kind of came up with, and that is your past thoughts plus your past behaviors equal your current results, right? So it doesn't say the event, your thought about the event, and your behaviors as a result of the event. And so if you want to change your future, and I think what you were saying earlier is important about how what we think now and what we do now affects our future, because our legacy is created every single day of our lives, right? A legacy doesn't start when you pass away. It starts now. And so the equation is your current thoughts and your current behaviors equal your future results.
Correct.
And so what result do you want? And align your thoughts and behaviors towards that result, and you might have a different outcome.
Abraham Lincoln, one of our greatest presidents, led us, of course, through the Civil War. One of his best quotes is, you live the life you think about. You live the life you think about. And so your life today and the results, whether you think they're good or whether you think they're great, are a byproduct of your thinking.
Absolutely. With that, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back from break, you don't want to miss this. We're going to have a fascinating discussion about Dr. Jeff Barnes' work in terms of Disneyland and what lessons can we learn in terms of personal development and some of the things that you may not have ever thought about the happiest place on earth. So please come back after this short break.
This edition of Break It Down Brown is brought to you by KCWG The Truth, Feeding your spirit with a total gospel music mix 24/7. For the best internet radio on the planet, lock it in at kcwgthetruth.com.
Welcome back to the Break It Down Brown Show. We're sitting here with our very special guest. He's an author, he's a professor, and an expert on the history of Disneyland in a way that you may not really have thought about. That's Professor Jeff Barnes. Professor, we talked a lot about history in the first half of the show, and I know that you are, I would consider, an expert on Disneyland, but not in the way that a lot of people might think, not in where the rides are and that type of thing,
Sure.
but really the background of Walt Disney and what that can teach us about life and about success. So kind of give us an overview as to how you developed your class that you teach on the history of Disneyland.
Sure. Well, the class actually originated as part of a lecture in my second half of U.S. history course, which is just part of the standard curriculum at California Baptist University. And naturally, when you get to the 1950s, in my opinion, you can't cover that decade without covering the opening of Disneyland, because it really was sort of a monumental cultural event that was very unique to the decade that was the 1950s. And when you think about the park opening in the middle month, meaning July, in the middle year of the 1950s, 1955, I would just make sure that we covered that. And I noticed that whenever I got to that particular topic, for that day, student interest peaked, meaning they were a little more engaged, a little more interested, and asked more questions than normal. And ultimately what happened, Jamar, was I asked the class, typically 60 plus students, well, how many of you have been to Disneyland? Of course, here in Southern California, Disneyland's 40 minutes away from CBU. Every single hand in that class of 60 plus went up. And then one day I asked a question further, and that was, well, how many of you were so young the first time that you went to Disneyland that you don't even remember your first visit? And lo and behold, 75% of those same hands went up. And that's when it dawned on me that we've got an entire generation, maybe two, here in Southern California, for whom Disneyland is in their backyard, and they really do treat it as like their own personal and private park, which is great. But because it's always been there, they don't know anything about the story. They don't know anything about the history. They don't know the risks that were involved and how unique and special it was when it first opened in 1955. And so naturally, because I'm interested in history and context and storytelling, I wanted students to have that background and have that context. And then I sort of connected the dots a little bit further and realized that the lessons in getting Disneyland built and the phenomenal success that it's been for the last 60 years now are really lessons that can apply to all of us. And so given that students just go to Disneyland automatically and they're just naturally interested in the subject of Disneyland, I really wanted to use that history and that story as a vehicle for teaching some success principles and challenging students to live the best life possible.
And I want to get to some of those success principles, but I do have to say something that's on my mind, and that is, I'm from California, and you ask your students how many of you have been to Disneyland, and most of the hands went up, and it made me think that there's a ride at Disneyland called California Adventure, and a lot of people that are from California don't see California until they take that ride. They don't know about California, so it's very interesting. So Disney has a lot of aspects of it. But I want to get back to now these success principles, because we think about Disneyland in general. I haven't taken your class, unfortunately, and we look at Disneyland from a place where you take your family and you see the rides and you see the Disney characters and you remember Mickey and Minnie and all these fun things. But you're looking at it a little bit deeper than that. So tell us about some of these success principles that you have developed from your study of Disneyland, and then let's maybe break down a couple of them a little bit further.
Sure. Well, first of all, when I taught the class this past summer, we started with a biography of Walt Disney himself.
Okay.
And you recognizing that he is the Walt Disney of Disneyland. And students, of course, have heard of Walt Disney, but the only side of the story that they know at this point is the success side, meaning he was this phenomenal showman, this wonderful entrepreneur, this creative genius, and he built this park that became the model for theme parks around the world. But what was really interesting was the very first day in that very first lecture, I began to share with them his life story, and most folks aren't aware that Walt went bankrupt very early in his career.
Okay.
That was shocking because, they just assume he was born successful.
Right.
People just assume, that, success happened automatically. Well, Walt followed the path that all of us have to follow, and particularly the path of, successful folks, and that is you have to risk. And in risking, you may actually fail, and that's okay. Another story in all of that was Mickey Mouse wasn't his first successful character.
Huh. I didn't. Okay.
His very first successful character was actually Oswald the Rabbit, which he and the studio produced after he came out following his first bankruptcy to California from Kansas City in 1923. And in 1927, Oswald had become so popular that Walt and his wife Lillian went back to New York, and they were trying to negotiate higher fees for the product and the character that they were producing.
Wow.
Well, unbeknownst to Walt, when he had signed the original contract, he didn't own the rights to Oswald anymore. And so when he asked for more money, he was surprised to find out that not only was he not going to get any more money, but the company was going to take Oswald away from him.
Wow.
And they had already proceeded to steal all of his animators except for one. Well, as you might imagine, that was a pretty lonely and depressing ride back from New York to California. And I don't know about you, Jamar, but if that were to happen to me in 2014, I'd be calling my attorney, I'd be on the phone with my counselor, I'd be in, whine, moan, and complain mode, right? Walt Disney didn't do that. First of all, he sent a telegram to his brother Roy and said, everything is great, and we've got a wonderful opportunity, and I can't wait to get home and talk to you about it.
I need to stop you for a second because I'm sitting here listening to that, and I would be just like you. I would be devastated. From a success principle standpoint, what was it that kept him positive and motivated, even though it was probably one of the lowest points in his life?
Confidence.
Okay.
Walt Disney believed that there were 4 C's related to success, and those C's are consistency, courage, confidence. I don't off the top of my head remember what the 4th one is, and he said out of those 4, far and away, confidence is the most important. And so he believed in his ideas, he believed in his dreams, he believed in his goals, and he believed in himself as a cartoonist. And so what he did on that train ride home was he sat down and he drew a brand new character. And he was remembering a little mouse that ran around in the hardscrabble office that he had there in Kansas City in his very first studio. And it was out of that memory and out of that moment of desperation that he drew Mickey Mouse for the very first time.
Wow, fascinating.
And he actually he wanted to name Mickey Mortimer.
And
his wife Lillian wisely said, no, I think that name's too heavy. And so they eventually came up with Mickey. And so again, every obstacle can become an opportunity. And
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think one of the things that you're saying, I don't want to leave the point before we really dive into it and break it down, because sometimes everybody fails, and like I said earlier, the only way to achieve success is to try something. But when you try something, you might fail. So failure is a natural part of success, which is trying. That's what I teach the people that I talk to. Another aspect of what you're saying is really, when something bad happens, to remember that you aren't that thing you created, right?
Right.
He's not that character that was stolen. He's the genius behind the character. I think people forget that sometimes. It's not what you've done and you've created this, because if you've done it once, you could do it again.
Right.
Just remember the successes that you had, and remember that it's not the thing there. You are the essence of what you created. Would you agree with that? Do you think that's something that Walt felt in his heart?
I would, and it's sort of fascinating. he learned his lesson from that and made sure he paid attention to the details of contracts and copyright and trademarks
Very
and
important.
what have you. The one animator who stayed faithful to him, the one animator who wasn't bought out from the other company, became the animator who was responsible for drawing Mickey Mouse again and again and again. I mean, there were days when Ib Urix, I can't ever pronounce his name properly, but he would show up and he would draw Mickey Mouse over 800 times a day.
Wow.
And so, Walt believed in himself as a cartoonist and an animator and as an idea person, but he also knew that as a leader, as long as he had one follower, he was going to be okay. And he still had a follower, and that follower believed in Walt's dream, believed in his vision, and it was so compelling that he was willing to stay and help make Mickey Mouse a reality. And eventually, as the character grew, Walt was readily to admit that Mickey Mouse became his alter ego. He spoke for Mickey, and Mickey, interestingly enough, spoke for Walt.
Interesting. You mentioned, dreams and passion, and so I would imagine, because Disney, is sort of seen as this place where you go to dream, and it's this magical place, and when you relay that to life, based on what I think I'm hearing you saying, what I hear you saying is that's about purpose and vision and having sort of this ideal life and this ideal world you want to create for yourself. So tell me about Walt's vision and his passion and how that can help the layperson like you and I to stay focused on what we're trying to achieve by having that clear purpose and vision in our minds.
Sure. Well, when it comes to Disneyland, again, that backstory is really important. First of all, the light bulb just went on for the students of, oh my gosh, Walt Disney had failed before. Oh my gosh, Walt Disney, had a bankruptcy. I might be okay with the C that I got in that class, last semester. My life's not over. I can still be successful. But when it came to Disneyland, the dream and the idea for that started on a Saturday. In Walt's family, Saturdays were Daddy's Day. That was the day when he took time out of his really busy schedule to spend a couple of hours with his young girls, Diane and Sharon. And they would head off. This is late 1930s, early 1940s, and they would head off to somewhere in Southern California. And on this particular day, they were up at Griffith Park, and they were riding a merry-go-round, and he was sitting on a park bench eating peanuts, doing nothing. And I mean, Walt's at the point in his life where he doesn't have a lot of time to sit around and do nothing. But it's Daddy's Day, and the merry-go-round is for kids, the park bench is for the parents, and so he's sitting there, with those peanuts keeping him company, and he begins to dream of a place where parents and children can go and have fun together, as opposed to be separated. And a place that would be clean, a place where it would be as attractive to adults as it is to children. And at that particular time in history, nothing like that existed anywhere in the world. And he began to talk to people, to include his wife Lillian, about building an amusement park. And Lillian say to him, "Oh, Walt, why do you want a stupid amusement park? They're dirty, they're filthy. I don't want anything to do with it." And Walt was like, "You don't get it. Mine is going to be different, and it's going to be clean." And so, he took what was and had a vision for making it different and had a vision for making it better. And if you look at his life and his career, he did that all along the way. So, for example, he pushed the envelope when it came to cartoons. When Mickey Mouse comes out by way of Steamboat Willie, it includes sound. Nobody else had sound before Walt showed up with Steamboat Willie. You then look at Snow White. Snow White is the first full-length animated picture. And everybody said nobody is going to sit through a full-length animated movie. And he nearly went bankrupt trying to fund that project, but he put everything on the table because he believed in his idea. And lo and behold, Snow White made so much money that he was able to turn around and use the profits from that to actually build the studio that still exists in Burbank today. Well, rinse and repeat when it comes to Disneyland. Nobody believed in the project. Walt has this idea that's never been done before, and he, again, puts all of his cards on the table extreme risk with the potential for extreme failure, and leverages everything because he has the confidence in his idea and his ability to execute that dream and execute that vision at a level never before seen.
Well, and taking from that story, I mean, how do you go about teaching that to your students? Because everybody's in the situation they are in now, whatever that case may be, and then they have what's called the gap. That's the difference between where they are now and where they'd like to be.
Sure.
And Walt Disney had the exact same situation. Sometimes it's very difficult to either keep it going because of the obstacles, and other times it's very difficult for people to even start because of the mental obstacles.
Sure.
So how do you translate the Walt's experience in helping your students develop the principles or ideas or steps to do the exact same thing? They're not building a Disneyland. Well, let me rephrase that. Whatever their vision is their Disneyland.
Right.
So how do you help them understand how to get there?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all,